Hey everybody, my name is Aaron Kazmarek and this is Eastern versus Western music theory. So in this lesson, what we're really going to discuss is the theoretical differences and the ways of approaching music outside of the Western Hemisphere. And of course comparing the two and getting a feel for really how they're different at the foundational level. And what we want to get from this is come away with a different way of thinking. And you'll ask, why is it important to think differently about this music, for instance? So, for example, let's take the addressing system in Japan. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but in Japan, the names of the streets are not named. Rather, blocks are named, which is really backwards from what we're used to in Western countries. So imagine that you're a Westerner trying to find an address in Japan using what you are used to in a Western country. Well, you'd find yourself quite lost, wouldn't you? Without understanding that the Japanese have a whole different way of thinking about location and geography and how they name it and how they keep track of it. So in a similar vein, when you're approaching a different musical system, if you don't understand those subtleties and those different ways that the people indigenous to that culture, into that culture's music, then you're going to find yourself lost. So the East versus West concept is really a popular way of putting it or understanding it. But I like to think about it differently. And I think in reality, what's more accurate is two classifications of all music throughout the world. The first is monophonic music, or what we call as modal music. The other is polyphonic music or harmonic music. Now, I like to think of these as two ends of a spectrum rather than two very rigid classifications. So on one end, where you have harmonic music or polyphonic music, we would use the example of classical Western music and even contemporary music, right? And whereas on the other end, the far end of that spectrum, the pure monophonic, pure modal music, a great example would be classical Indian music or Hindustani music. Now, a really easy way of understanding the difference between monophonic music and polyphonic music, or in other words, modal music versus harmonic music, is to look at the difference between an arpeggio versus a chord. So let's take a G major arpeggio, for instance. Versus a G major chord. Really simple, right? Well, at the foundation, monophonic music can be understood as melody expressed in a succession of individual pitches played one at a time. Whereas in polyphonic music, the musician is able to employ simultaneous pitches that create harmony, chords, and compositional complexity. So if we go back to the image of music being on a spectrum, where at one end we have monophonic music and on the other end we have polyphonic, where the extreme of the one is Western and the other extreme is, say, Indian classical. Well, we have examples that fit somewhere in the middle. For instance, Eastern European or Balkan music is actually a little bit in between pure monophonic and pure polyphonic music. And we could also put Spanish flamenco. And even Middle Eastern music and Middle Eastern maqam shares a lot of similarities to American jazz, for instance. And we could see some crossovers into that side of the spectrum. So everything's not purely black and white, but the best way to really understand what's possible and the differences in all the different musics of the world is to get a hold of the two ends of that spectrum. So I like to think of things in analogies, and in this instance I thought of sports. So for our example of harmonic music, I thought of a team sport, let's say football or American soccer. And then for our example of modal music, I thought of mixed martial arts, fighting, MMA. So if we look at these as sports, for instance, now in football, there's some components that make them different. In football, we have a number of specific rigid rules and procedures of how the game is played, what is allowed, what is not allowed. For instance, you have to kick the ball with your foot. You can't throw the ball. There's all these specific things of how the game is played and how it's done. And then also you have a team. You have a team of players where each member of the team has a different role. They have a specific role that they play, and you don't have mixing, whereas you only have one goalie, you only have one set of defenders and one set of forwards or offense. And then also the strategy is very collaborative, it's very team oriented. So the way of moving the ball across the field and scoring a goal requires an entire team. Now, on the other hand, if we think about the mixed martial artist, we understand that it's an individual sport. There's only one guy, there's no team. And the rules are actually pretty limited. Of course, you have some things that you can't do, but for instance, in mixed martial arts, you can change forms. You can go on the ground, you can fight with fists or feet. There's all different things you can do, and there's not a lot of limitation. Also, there's only one person that fills all the positions. So the one person has to do both roles of defense and offense, and there's no other support. And then lastly is the strategy. The strategy is, again, on a single person. So it's up to that one person to strategize and improvise in the moment of how to accomplish the end, which is winning, which is a knockout or a takedown or a submission. Now let's think about that in musical terms. So if we imagine that harmonic music is like a football team, then we realize that the rules that we have, the procedures, could be analogous to a key signature and could be analogous to the 12-tone musical scale. Those are things that would limit you in play of what you can do and what you can't do, at least in terms of what is consonant and what is not. Also, the way harmonic music is structured, it requires multiple parts. It requires a team of musicians or a team of pitches to come together to create that harmonious whole. And then, of course, the strategy and the focus in harmonic music has less to do with the individual parts, but more to do with how all the parts come together and create one big composition. Now, on the other hand, in modal music, like a fighter, there's less rules. And so in modal music, there's a lot more freedom to transpose, to modulate, and to go and to take the music in a bunch of different musical directions. Also, and this goes in many other non-Western musical systems, there is plenty more than just 12 tones that we're used to. Now, the musicians can be one or a few, but there's limited roles of what those musicians can do. At the far extreme, when we thought of Indian classical music, in the purest forms, you really only ever have two musicians, one melody musician and one rhythm musician. And there is so much complexity in the individual part that adding any more musicians just muddles the music and turns it into a mess. It's like if we think about a fighter in a ring, there's just one fighter versus another fighter. But if you throw 20 fighters into the same ring, it just becomes it just becomes chaos. It becomes a mess, right? So we have a very limited amount of fighters. And if we imagine that there is more than one musician in this analogy, those parts have to be pretty simple when they're played in accompaniment. Still, there's a focus on a main musician or a main melodic line, and that is the overarching strategy of modal music too, is to create a very complex and a very nuanced and detailed narrative that's being expressed through one melodic voice. Now again, there's crossovers, and not every example of music fits into this spectrum in a very black and white way. For instance, if we think of contemporary American music like R&B and blues, the accompaniment section, the compositions are usually very simple, whereas the soloists are using a lot of decorations. They use a lot of melisma and a lot of ornamentation and create a lot of interest through their voice, and which becomes the focal point. whereas everything else is a little bit downplayed. So in that instance, we're really taking a lot from modal music to create the complexity and color and tonal color in that music. And again, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of similarities between Middle Eastern maqam music and American jazz also, and the way of transposing and modulating within a composition. And we could also think of some outliers like African marimba music and Balinese gamelan, for instance. Those melodically are very, very rigid and tight because the instruments are fixed. You really can't do much, and the scales are usually very simple, just 4 or 5 tone scales. But still, they're not really employing harmony in the way that we think in the West. It's very much a syncopated thing where there's lots of different monophonic voices all playing in between each other, which create an orchestral composition, but it still can be broken down into these monophonic lines. And that's just some of the outliers that are a little tricky to put into this classification on this spectrum. So far it can seem like modal music and harmonic music are two very different things. But really, when we understand the origins of harmonic music, we realize that harmonic music actually sprung or grew from modal music. Western music had a lot of similarities to Eastern music as we go back in time. And where that split happened, where they're sort of branching off from the rest of the world playing modal music, it has a lot to do with of course, harmony. And understanding that there are some inherent difficulties with harmony and with chords in the modal music system. And the best way we can explain this is by taking an Eastern instrument. This is a Turkish bağlama, which if you look at the neck, you can see that there's a really interesting fret pattern. So this instrument actually has quarter tone frets, or we would, if you're used to whole tones, half tones, or whole steps, half steps on the guitar, this one actually has steps that are in between. They're not exactly a quarter, but they are in between. So we could take a mode that employs one of these microtones, one of these unique pitches. So in this case, I'm gonna play a pitch that's sort of in between a flat 6 and a natural 6, which is. So we're pretty much playing a minor scale, but the flat 6 is a little bit sharp. It's very interesting. For some people it probably doesn't sound good, but it's something that if you're not used to it, you do become you do acquire a taste for it. So the issue here, if we look at this scale, is we have this slightly sharp flat 6. Now, when we try to play harmonies, when we try to play 2 notes at the same time, we don't have a lot of problems until we start trying to harmonize that sharp flat 6. So you can really hear how ugly that sounds. So this was a problem. This was a problem in early music as musicians and cultures began to explore harmony and taking the modes of the ancient world and beginning to layer them into harmonies. So these pitches that people were used to were creating ugliness and dissonance when they added them, when they sung them or played them with other pitches. So now, early theoreticians realized that you could sort of make a sacrifice, and you could shift that pitch into a place that would be an approximation of the original pitch that they wanted, but kind of sacrifice a bit of that. For instance, being a near minor scale, with the exception of that sharp flat 6, if we just push that down a little bit and make it more of a pure flat 6 like what we're used to, well, then we can harmonize like this. And it all sounds good. So as Western music developed, a number of different tuning systems were developed as well to account for this problem. And one thing people don't realize is that it didn't just jump from modal music to the harmonic 12-tone scale that we're used to now, but it went through a number of different ideas and tunings before we arrived at the equal tempered 12-tone scale that we have in Western music today. And what this scale really achieves is it compensates for all the problems of modal music, which is that you can't harmonize microtonal pitches. And also with these instruments, it's very difficult to transpose to different keys, and it's difficult to have a number of instruments play together in an ensemble, in an orchestra, if they all have unique string styles or unique tunings. So the need for a standardized, equidistant tuning system was a necessity in the development of harmonic music. So to further demonstrate what we have in modal music, and to learn exactly what was sacrificed in creating harmonic music, we can look at a modal instrument like the oud. And the oud is fretless, so we have a lot of possibility for tones and for ornamentation and decorating the melody. It's also played usually as a solo instrument, sometimes in an ensemble, but it really shines as a solo instrument, and the traditional music is typically played as a soloist. So if we take a maqam, we can see that for one thing there's microtones, but there's also a lot of coloration, a lot of modulation where the pitches change within the scale. So we can start here. So we break it down, we could have a wholly different approach to the ascending versus the descending, and then have all sorts of variations within there. So for instance, this is somewhat similar to a major scale, and the descent is somewhat similar to a mixolydian. And then we can throw this coloration in here of having both a minor third and a natural third. So I'm a little rusty on the oud, but you kind of see that there's a lot of possibility. There's a lot of possibility that we can do. However, it's still limited compared to, say, a Western piano or guitar, and that it's very difficult to modulate and play into different keys. Like if I have to move this whole thing up a half step, I kind of lose a lot of what makes the oud an oud. And with that comes really that sacrifice. So we have the two musical systems. One is very focused on how parts come together in harmony to produce a whole, whereas in the modal music system, we really have almost no harmony at all in some cases. Sometimes we have very simple melodics, but sometimes we have very, very complex systems of putting together melodic phrases. All right, so let's explore these concepts further. And in this case, we're going to use the guitar, and we're going to kind of explore more the relationship between modal music, harmonic music, and crossover, places where we can go in between. So there is a lot we can do with a Western instrument like the guitar, and we don't have the quarter notes, and we don't have the pitches that we do on an Eastern instrument, but there's still a lot that we can learn from Eastern music that we can apply. So first, let's explore modal music on the guitar. And in this case, I'm just going to play a basic drone of just the tonic, and I'm just going to improvise and free play over that. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to start with just a major scale, but then start to color it and start to add ornamentation, start to add modulations, and then maybe even kind of just take it into some whole other directions and then come back. So I'll set a very simple drone. Okay. Now, let's see where we have problems when we try to apply the concepts in modal music to harmonic music. We start running into a lot of dissonance. We don't have that room to just explore melodically as freely as we can in modal music. So I'm going to make this really basic again, but in this case, my drone is going to be a full G major chord. So here we have the one, the natural third, major third, and the fifth, right? Now if I try to play some of these same things, some of them work, but some of them don't. really give some emphasis to that minor third, it sounds off played against the major third. You can't quite do that either. So when we play that major chord, now we're limiting, we're imposing more rules on what can be done melodically. And then as we start adding, say, a chord progression behind it, that's a silly 1/4, but we'll just imagine there's a chord progression behind that, and then we have a whole band. Well, we can't really be doing all kinds of interesting things like playing minor thirds and starting to impose Middle Eastern scales over what would otherwise be, say, like an upbeat, a 1/4/5. Then we're really limited to just playing in that G major scale. Right? Now, on the other hand, let's take Balkan music, where the way they get around this is by simplifying the accompaniment. So, for instance, you'll hear this a lot in Balkan music, where the bass tones are really just a 1/5 kind of thing. So in that case, by just playing the 1 and the 5, we have a nice accompaniment, and we can do a lot of things interesting rhythmically, and even a little bit melodically in the accompaniment, but we still leave lots of room for this melodic exploration. And even in the cases of compositions, you'll have chord progressions, but those chord progressions are still very simple and still lend to those types of modulations. And then, of course, in a solo section, you'll usually hear the accompanying instruments playing something very simple. Right? So there's where we can kind of find that happy medium. And you'll find that in other musics, even in Spanish music and the Spanish music in Central and South America as well. We find these kind of modulations and these hints at Middle Eastern scales, which of course comes from the Moorish influence in Spain years and years and years ago. Okay, so in conclusion, we're going to go back to the analogy of the sports, the team versus the individual, the football team versus the fighter. So in modal music, you're being like a fighter. And one of the ways that strategy is different in fighting than from, say, football, is that in football, the strategy is about a team and how everyone comes together to accomplish the goal. Whereas a fighter trains by learning sequences, combinations of moves that work at particular moments. So a fighter can't be bound by structure. A fighter has to be able to improvise and be flexible and to move freely, but also how to sequence his moves in a way that makes sense. And this is what makes modal music, similar to fighting, very complex, or it can be very complex in certain systems because there's so many different combinations. And like a fighter, modal musicians don't think of music in terms of scales like we do in the West, but they think about melody in terms of combinations and sequences that fit together well. That in the instance where we play a scale that has both a major third and a minor third, it may not sound good if we just play through those notes. It can be a little weird, or it can just lack feeling. Whereas when we learn how to orient those melodies in a way where we really can emphasize, for instance, going ascending through the major and up to we can ascend through the major third up to the fourth and fifth, and then come back down, back to the fourth, and then to the minor third, and it creates this very kind of upward motion, and then it creates this downward motion in how we feel the music, and it creates a lot of interest. But knowing how to put those notes together is the most important thing, and that's what lends to so much variety. So when we think about scales in the West, we're really limited because scales are just a series of intervals that break up an octave. And we really don't have that many employed in Western music. We have the 7 major modes, and then sometimes we have pentatonic scales, and we sometimes use harmonic minor and melodic minor. And there's a few other exotic scales that you might call a scale that are sometimes used in jazz, but really we're still limited to maybe a dozen. Whereas in Indian music, there are up to hundreds of ragas, which would be the equivalent of a mode in Western music. And the reason being is that playing a raga isn't just like playing a scale. It's not just a matter of playing through a succession of pitches up and down, but it's a matter of how groups of pitches are oriented together, how they relate to each other, and how you can create interesting complexities in the music by moving through those sequences, just like a fighter moves through sequences of moves in order to accomplish his goal. And if we go back to the fighter analogy, it's like imagining a fighter trying to kick someone when he's 10 feet away and then do a block. It doesn't make any sense for where he's positioned. It makes sense for that fighter to take a couple steps and then do a block and then do a kick, where that sequence makes sense and continues a motion that achieves his goal. So in a similar way of melody, we can't just arbitrarily put different combinations together, but we have to learn what combinations make sense and what sound good. And that's where we really start the journey of learning Eastern music. It's not about understanding a theory per se, but it's really about exploration and learning and experimenting with different things that sound good. So that's it for this lesson. I hope you got something from this. I hope that you can walk away with something to think about and some interesting ideas for how you can start to approach studying non-Western music, whether that be Balkan music or whether it be Turkish or Indian or flamenco or anything outside of Western European and American music. Please like the video, please share, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.